Recently, I played through Monster Hunter World again, all the way to beating Fatalis, and it sparked a memory in me. When I was a little human, I got this game for Christmas from my parents and played the hell out of it. So much so that I'd get a tattoo later in my life. But when I was younger, I had a question that I dropped pretty quickly, being, what the hell are these things, and how the hell did the designers come up with them? After looking at some things online, nothing really showed up, and I kind of just dropped the topic, but while playing again recently, it got me thinking about that same question, so again, I looked it up, and couldn't really find anything other than a few Reddit threads with some one-word answers, which wasn't really enough for me. So here I am now, and I'm going to be talking about what each monster is based on, or most likely based on. Real quick though, if you do want to watch a video that has good research about monsters and Monster Hunter, I would recommend these videos, as my research consisted of looking at a monster, glancing at it, saying, yes, this is clearly a frog. And if any other information came up, then I would also include that. I'm sure a lot of my information is just wrong, just from how much I had to look at. So if you do notice that I'm missing either monsters or facts about the monsters for what they're related to, please let me know in the most aggressive way down below. Starting with the rules and setup for this whole thing, I will not be talking about Frontier or any of the mobile games or spin-offs or anything like that. I will only talk about the mainline games and extensions of those. And starting with some of the groundwork, here's a checklist that I'll be going through in no particular order, being order of talking about monsters, differences between kinds of dragons, variants and subspecies of monsters, and monster classifications. Looking at how monsters are classified is weird in Monster Hunter, as some monsters are classified as flying wyverns, but they never fly or have wings. But the main point for this is that there are three main sections of monsters, being small, large, and elder dragons, which I will put under each monster for reference. But looking at the name for Elder Dragon is really misleading, because most of the Elder Dragons are not actually dragons, but it more refers to a classification to show that the monster is really dangerous and can destroy an ecosystem by themselves. Talking about the order we're going to be going over the monsters, originally I was going to go over monsters introduced in each game alphabetically, like this, but I decided that would be really boring, and also they would introduce subspecies later on, so I would talk about like Rathalos, and then like 3 generations later I'd talk about a different version of Rathalos, which just seems very repetitive. So instead, I decided to go over the monsters in an order of boring monsters that are like pretty clear on what they're based on, monsters I'm completely just guessing, and then monsters that I found either interesting or funny. When I'm talking about these monsters, which there are 294 that I found, I'm going to just be going over the main games, including Rise, because they introduce quite a lot of monsters. The games include these. I will not be going over any monsters from Wilds yet, even though I could look at them. I choose not to because I don't want to, because the game is not out yet. Plus, when talking about a monster, I will be talking about their variant at the same time, just to make things flow a little bit better. Next, we have differences in dragons and dragon-like creatures. When I talk about a monster and I say it has the body of a wyvern, I need you to know what I'm talking about. So let's start with dragons. There are many different dragons to speak, so I'll keep it quick, being there's mostly European dragons, which got 4 legs and a set of wings and a cheeky little head. And then there's Japanese dragons, which are long like a snake and got 4 legs, and they kind of just float, and sometimes have fins too, and sometimes don't have any legs. Looking at wyverns, that's what most of the monsters in this game are just wyverns, being 2 thick back legs, and then their arms are just a set of wings. And then looking at drakes, they usually look exactly like a dragon, but a bit chunkier and without wings, so they're just little ground dragons. And lastly, we have Leviathans, which there's not many of in Monster Hunter. Leviathans are pretty similar to Japanese dragons, except they're a bit thicker, and also they don't fly, and they usually don't have legs either, so they just swim around. That finishes off the list, so let's just jump right in. Starting out with Bullfongo and Bulljerome. They're literally just a wild boar with some spikes on its back, possibly from like an Ankylosaurus. Moving on, we have Yankutku, which is based on a frilled lizard with the addition of a pelican, and Blue Yankutku, which is the same, except it's slightly smaller and is blue. Then we have Blongo, which has most of its looks from a mandrill, with some looks from the Japanese macaque, but especially the anger of a Japanese macaque. Then for Blaganga, it's the grown-up version of Blongo, but with the tusks of I assume to be a walrus, and the Copper Blaganga, which has grown brown fur to help adaptation to the desert, to blend in more. Then the Conga, which is based on a gorilla with a hippo head, with the addition of pink fur, and the Congalala, which is just a larger version with a monkey tail, and the Emerald Congalala, which is a variant built specifically to live in the jungle and or marsh. Then the Nargacuga, which looks like a panther mixed with a vampire bat, and the Green Nargacuga, which is green, has a green tail, and yellow eyes. Lucent Nargacuga has azure bluish scales to it, white fur, and a golden chest. And the Silverwind Nargacuga, which has bits of white fur aligned in stripes, and has more tail spikes than the normal version, and is just larger in general. Then there's the Quechawacha, being a lemur mixed with an elephant and climbing picks, and the Ash Quechawacha, which has a more washed blue pelt and spits fire. Then the Najarala is a king cobra and rattlesnake mixed together, and the Tidal Najarala, which has a more blue, yellow, and gray hide, and purple and green spines. Then looking at the Astalos, it's based on a pterosaurs, dragonfly wings, and insect carapaces in general. And the Bolt Reaver Astalos has a more turquoise color to it. Its wing claws, tail pincers, and head crest are larger than the normal variant, and is always in a green charge, like the normal version's enraged state. But the Bolt Reaver version, when it gets enraged, goes further to a blue charge. Then looking at Malfestio, it's most likely based on either the Great Horned Owl or the Long-Eared Owl, as well as a bee from some of its attacks of spreading pollen to attack you. And the Nightcloak Malfestio has more golden scales on its chest and wings, as well as red webbing and red tail feathers. Then looking at the Puke Puke, it's based on poison colorful flowers, which I interpret as the corpse flower, and a frog, as well as an accordion and having some chameleon feet. And then there's the Coral Puke Puke, which has a more bright orange color with some pinkish red added to it, and shooting water for that coral theming to it. Then looking at the Acnosome, it's based on a bird, most likely the crane, mixed with the Kasa Obake yokai, and standing on one leg makes it look a little bit more like that umbrella, but birds do this in real life. A lot of people think that it's just flamingos that do this, but all birds do this, and the reason why they do this is because standing in water or standing out makes their feet really cold because of how long they are, so they lift up one foot at a time to make it close to their body to warm their feet. Almudron is based on the Dorotabo yokai, mixed with a Chinese dragon. Magma Almudron has a more bluish gray and crimson colors to it, and a red glow throughout, like magma, and it's also smaller than the normal variant. Bishaten is based on the Tengu, namely its nose, wings, and the sort of like trickery it does by throwing objects at you. And Blood Orange Besaden has an orange and black color scheme to it, and the tips of its wings are yellow, and it also throws pine cones at you. Genprey is part of what I like to call the Raptor Gang, which is a lot of small and large monsters at the beginning of games are just based on raptors from Jurassic Park. So Genprey is based on a raptor, as well as having a little bit of Dilophosaurus in it for paralysis from Jurassic Park. Real world Dilophosaur did not spit acid or paralytic bile. And it also has some head flaps from a furrowed lizard. And the Gendrome is just the alpha version of a Genprey. Eoprey is, again, a raptor, but it's also a mix of a Pachycephalosaur with its hard head, and also taking some Jurassic Park Dilophosaurus with spitting acid. And Eodrome is just the alpha Eoprey. Velociprey is again a raptor, but mixed with Edward Scissorhands, otherwise known as the Therizinosaurus. And the Velocidrome is just the alpha version of the Velociprey. There's Gyaprey, which is the same as Velociprey, but it's an ice variant that has evolved to live in snowy and Arctic regions. And the Gyadrome is just the same as the Velocidrome, but an ice variant. The Boggy is a raptor with the addition of ice and sleep, and the Great Boggy is just the alpha version of a Boggy. The Jaggy is again a raptor mixed with the furrowed lizard, but what makes this species type a lot different is it actually has a specific female version, being the Jaggia, and the Great Jaggy is the alpha version of the Jaggy. Then there's the Roggy, which is a raptor mixed with a frog neck, and that spits poison out, and the Great Roggy, which is the alpha version of Roggy. Then there's Renplos, which is a little bit of rhino, a little bit of Casimosaurus, and a little bit of Protoceratops. And then there's the Macau, going back to the raptors, but this time, instead of a Jurassic Park raptor, it's based on an actual raptor in real life, being that they're feathered. And the fighting is inspired by Muay Thai, and it also has a bit of its looks from a kangaroo. And the Great Macau being the alpha version of the Macau. Moving on to Izuchi, it's based on the Kamaitachi and the Dromaeosaur, and the Great Izuchi is just the bigger version. Then the Boggy is a mix of a raptor as well as goblins and or gremlins. Looking at Kuyaku, it has a dodo aesthetic as well as habits and looks from the Oviraptor, specifically the egg-stealing habits it was thought to be had. And then looking at the Zitsuyaku, it's mostly just based off of a Dilophosaurus. Then looking at the Gyros, it's based on like an average lizard and or a cobra salamander, and the Great Gyros is just a bigger Gyros, and I can only assume that the reason why they have paralysis is some snakes have paralytic bile in their fangs. And then moving on to the Jagras, it's based on an iguana, and the Great Jagras is just a bigger Jagras with the addition of, after eating things, it gains an enlarged stomach, most commonly seen after snakes finish eating their food. Then moving on to the winged small monsters, we have the Remabra, which is just a snake with wings. Then the Mernos, which is based off of one of these. The Noios, which is a vulture and a pterosaur mixed together. Then the Raphanos, which is most likely a parrot or turkey mixed with a tapajarid. Then the Cortos, which is most likely a pterosaur mixed with the head of a copper-headed snake. Then moving on to the Apsaros, is based on an Ankylosaurus, except for more of a turtle-like shell and a spiked tail. Then the Aptonoth, which is based off of the Parasaurolophus, but with a spiked crown to it and spiked tail, and is a full quadrupedal, unlike the actual dinosaur. Then the Feline, which is just a bipedal cat that has a more of an ability to talk. And then looking at the Malinx, it's the same as a feline, but they have bandanas on, which makes them evil. and steal things. Then there's the Grimalkin, which is a more tribal-like version of the feline. Then moving on to Mosswine, it's based on a pig, not a boar. You can tell because there's not tusks. And it has the head of a pachycephalosaur and the moss back of either a sloth or a turtle. Then looking at the Anteca, it's a mix of a reindeer and a moose, but with the exception of having some really fine facial hair. Then looking at the Popo, it resembles a woolly mammoth mixed with a wild yak. And then the Gargua, which resembles dodo birds, turkeys, and cassowaries. And the Mufa, which resembles alpacas and rams mixed together. Then moving to the Laranoth, it's most likely based on sauropods or the Jurassic Park Brachiosaurus. Then looking at the Gastodon, it's a mix of the Hypsilophodon and a bison. And for the longest time, I thought it was Gastrodon, not Gastodon, but that's just a Pokemon. And the Kestodon, which is literally just a Pachycephalosaurus. Then looking at the Bombagi, it's based on the Bakadunaki yokai. And the Canine, which is based on a dog, specifically either a scent hound or a sight hound. Then the Vespoid, which is based on a wasp, as well as a really old dragonfly, otherwise known as the Paleodictyoptera, which had 6 wings, but despite having the 6 wings, only 4 of them actually worked, and the other 2 didn't actually work, but technically it did have 6 wings. And the Vespoid Queen, which is just like the queen of the hive, like a queen wasp. Then the Great Thunderbug, which is based on fireflies, and is just a larger version of a thunderbug. Then there's Alteroths, which are based on honey ants, which in the game have these giant sacs on the back, which I can only assume are filled with honey or the equivalent of in the Monster Hunter world. Then the Conchu, which is based on a pillbug, horseshoe crab, and giant sea scorpions, which I have no idea if the giant sea scorpions are actually real or if I have been gaslit by Google. Next, looking at the Kurupeko, it's based on a frigate bird and bagpipes, as well as a little bit of toucan in the beak. And the Crimson Kurupeko, which is red and uses lightning. Looking at the Arzuros, it's based on a honey badger and a bear. I'm going to assume the Asian black bear from the pattern on the chest. And then the Red Helm Arzuros is much larger than the normal variants, and its body has a more blood red color, while the rest of it is blue and some greenish blue on it. And the fur on the top of the head resembles a mohawk, which gives it like a flair to it. Then the Duramboros, which is based on rhinos, elephants, buffaloes, and the Ankylosaurus. And the Rust Duramboros, which is covered in sand and grit, giving it a more copper slash like rusty tone to it, and has developed an axe-like tail club rather than the normal variant's hammer-like tail club. Then there's the Kezu, which resembles more of a leech. It also is blind, so it uses vibrations to sense things. And the Red Kezu, which is red. And another thing about the Kezu, while I've been looking up images for all these, I found some wonderful images of Kezu. Here's one of them. Have fun looking at it. I definitely did not. Then looking at the Deviljho, some think that it's based on apex predators, such as the T-Rex, but in reality, I think it's based on a pickle. You can see it quite clearly. He's just a pickle. And the Savage Deviljho is just really angry. It's a really angry pickle. And the Glavenus was originally designed to be a land-based Rathalos, but ended up looking more like a Carnosaur with a knife for a tail, and its mouth is meant to be more of a whetstone. Then the Hellblade Glavenus. All Hellblade Glavenus are male and larger than the normal variants. They have a more deep red coloration, and the horns and spines on it are longer, and he also has a throat-situated flame sac, which allows it to spew fire, as well as sharpen the tail with more like magma heat, like those 1,000-degree knife videos. And the acidic Glavenus, which are also all male, except they have a more emerald bluish color to them, and the tail is covered in yellow-like ammonium crystals, and when scraped off, they reveal a more dull blue katana-like blade. And then looking at the Odogaron, it's based on the Kamaitachi sickle weasel, and potentially a Gorgonospid, and the Ebony Odogaron has a more jet black blue color to it, and the claws are more serrated, and its mouth also emits a black smoke. Then the Paolumu, which is based on the Honduran white bat, as well as pufferfish, and the chameleon for its feet. Then the Nightshade Paolumu has a more purple-black color to it, and 2 spots on its neck, so that when it blows up, resemble eyes, which is taken from either a peafowl or a butterfly. Then there's Magnamalo, which is mostly based on a tiger mixed with samurai armor, as well as a Yari spear for its tail, as well as will-o-wisps for some of its attacks. And Scorned Magnamalo is just a battle-ridden Magnamalo, being that it has serrated arm blades, larger fangs, and a jagged back shell that will unfold when it's enraged. It's also missing its right horn and eye, and the body has pink hellfire instead of like the purple of the normal, as well as the body has a more dark purple color to it, and red scars that glow across its body. Then looking at the Cephalos, it resembles a hammerhead shark or a Diplocalus, and it also kind of has fins like a flying fish, and is also blind, but it uses vibrations to navigate like a mole rat. And then there's the Cephadrome, which is just the bigger version of a Cephalos. Next, looking at Diablos, it has a more exaggerated Triceratops-looking head, and an Ankylosaurus-like tail in the shape of an axe. And Black Diablos are normal Diablos, but with a black color, and are actually all female Diablos going through their mating season, which makes them much more aggressive. And then looking at the Bloodbath Diablos, this was a Diablos that had one of its horns broken off, and it proceeded to grow in warped, while the other one grew very massive, and it has a more bluish color to it with red glowing veins. Next, looking at the Monoblos, it has the head of a Styracosaurus, and the tail of an Ankylosaurus and Stegosaurus, and the bonus of being literally better than the Diablos in every way possible. And then there's the White Monoblos, which is the same as the normal, but when enraged, blood rushes to the outside of its skin, so you can see its veins. Next is the Tigrex. Shockingly, this one is based off of a tiger and a T-Rex. Then the Brute Tigrex, which has adapted to more harsher environments, and has a more darker color palette to it, and has a better set of robust lungs, so that it does more screaming attacks, and it does more damage. Then there's the Molten Tigrex, which is adapted to volcanic regions, having a more blood red color to it, with blue spines and claws, and is also larger than the normal Tigrex. Lastly, looking at the Grimclaw Tigrex, their forelimbs have a blue coloration, with pulsating veins, and when enraged, they glow red and are more visible on the chest. Then the Delex, which has the body of a sailfish and the head of an alligator. For the Baroth, it's heavily based on bulldozers, and one of its attacks has a train whistle for when it charges at you. Then the Jade Baroth, despite being called the Jade Baroth, its skin is not made out of jade, and its skin is just green, and instead of covering itself with mud, it actually covers itself with snow. Then the Volvodon, which is an anteater, armadillo, and bombardier beetle. Next, looking at the Plesioth, it's a weird mix of a goblin shark-like head and the fin structure of a lionfish, but its eyes don't really seem like they actually see anything, even though it can. and the eyes also look like they might want to rip your soul out. And then there's the green Plesioth, which is green. Next is the Ceanotar, which is a hermit crab mixed with praying mantis looking hands. Then looking at the Shogun Ceanotar, it's the same as the Ceanotar but bigger, and it also uses a Gravios skull. And then looking at the Terra Shogun Ceanotar, it has a more reddish brown to it, as well as the Gravios skull. But in the game lore, it specifically says that it's technically not a subspecies and it's just the same, but has a different skin color. Then looking at the Rust Razor Ceanotar, its blades are in different shapes, and they turn blue when they're sharpened, and they switch between having a Glavenus skull and a Gravios skull on their back. Then looking at the Hermitar, it's just straight up a hermit crab, nothing else. And the Daimyo Hermitar is a larger version of the Hermitar, but its shell was replaced with the skull of a Monoblos. And then looking at the Plum Daimyo Hermitar, it's a purple variant that uses a Diablos skull. And then lastly, looking at the Stone Fist Hermitar, it has a more bluish purple coloration, and its left claw has grown to quite a degree, resembling those crabs that have the one claw that's bigger, and their name's actually the Fiddler Crab. And then looking at the Epioth, it seems like a Diplodocus mixed with a Plesiosaur. Next is the Gigi, which is an underwater glow-in-the-dark leech. So it's basically just a leech mixed with some form of bioluminescence. And then looking at the Giganox, it's the same as a Gigi, but with the addition of a wyvern body and tree frog legs. And then lastly, the Baleful Giganox, which just glows differently. Then we have the Gobble, which sounds like a cute name, but it actually looks like Hellspawn, and is a mix of an oarfish, anglerfish, gulper eel, and viper fish. And it reminds me of the Hellspawn of those eels from Mario. Next, looking at Lagiacrus, it's based on just the average Leviathan, as well as an electric eel and a viper. For the subspecies, we have the Ivory version and the Abyssal version. The Ivory version has more white scales and spends much more time on land. And the Abyssal version is much larger and darker than the normal version, with some bioluminescence on it, and is almost always in deep remote areas of the ocean, so you'll never be fighting it on land. Next we have the Nibblesnarf, which again sounds cute, but is not, and is based on a flatfish, salamander, and axolotl. Then we have Tetsukabra, which is based on a bullfrog with the bonus of fangs and attacks with sumo wrestler type technique to it. Then we have the Berserk Tetsukabra, which has a more dark green body and brown tusks due to soot and gas from the explosive rocks that it crushes in its mouth. Then we have the Drill Tusk Tetsukabra, which its horns are longer and more pointed. It has longer tusks with one larger than the other, and it also has blue markings across some of its scales. Then the Mizutsune, which is based on foxes, salamanders, and cherry blossoms, and the Soulseer Mizutsune, which are all male and are bigger than the normal versions. They will coat their claws and tail with bubbles, and they also have just longer claws in general. It also has a scar across its face, which blinds it, but it will open its left eye when enraged, and it'll also glow blue. Then the Violet Mizutsune, which again are all male, have more white lilac scales to it, with streaks of indigo and black fur, and when enraged, the fur will glow a faint blue, and the subspecies is also much larger than the normal versions. Next, looking at the Somnicanth, is based on Western or Japanese mermaids, as well as sea otters, and the Aurora Somnicanth has a more pale yellow color to it, and its fins are more of an ice blue. Its bioluminescence is also white instead of the light blue of the normal version, and frost forms on its head crest and tail. Then the Tetranodon, which is just based off of a Kappa yokai and sumo wrestlers. Next, for the Barioth, it's based on a saber-toothed tiger mixed with ice climbing picks. And for the variants, we have the Sand Barioth being a more orangish yellow-red color, and it lives in the desert, and the Frostfang Barioth, which has icy fangs and thicker fur across its body, and its body also has a lot of frost on it. After that, we have the Lagombi, which is based on the Diprotodon, as well as a koala, and the Snow Baron Lagombi, which has more darker fur on the lower half and back, and the belly of it is more purple, and the armored section on its forearms aren't visible anymore due to the fur that has grown. And lastly, the ears are more oval-shaped, opposed to the original variant's trapezoidal ears. Then, looking at the Gammoth, it's based on a woolly mammoth, and the Elderfrost Gammoth, they're all females and have a more bluish fur to them, and have slightly different head plating from the normal version, and they have sharper tusks. Then looking at the Bonbaro, it's based on deer, moose, or caribou, as well as snow shovels. Then looking at Shengaren, it's based on a Japanese spider crab, as well as a hermit crab, and its skull is from that of a Laoshanglong. And looking at Chameleos, it's based on an Uroplatus, but it also has some traits of a chameleon, being the eyes, tongue, and walking method, and unfortunately, chameleons do not turn actually invisible in real life, so I can only assume that Chameleos uses witchcraft. And then Kushala, which is based on a normal dragon, but also based on a metal statue of a dragon. And looking at Rusted Kushala, it's an older variant of Kushala that is oxidized and is almost ready to shed its skin and grow larger. And a cool thing that I'd like to mention is on the normal variant of Kushala, you can see the oxidization on the snout of it, which is from it inhaling oxygen, which is just a cool fact, because that would be the first place it would rust. Then looking at Teostra, it's a European dragon mixed with a lion, and Lunastra, which is the same as Teostra, but instead of red, it's blue, so it's got a hotter flame. And then there's Amatsu, which is heavily based on European dragons and flowing kimono and or yukata. Next for Dalamadur, it's based on anacondas, boas, snakes in general, as well as most likely the world serpent, and it's reminiscent of the amphitheater and or Quetzalcoatl. And Shah Dalamadur, which has a more white tone to it, as well as red spines and bigger face spikes. Then looking at Nergigante, the original designs for it were going to be a gecko-like science fiction-esque creature, but that was then used for a different monster, and then they decided to go on a more dragon, porcupine, and bearded dragon type of look to it. And then for Ruiner Nergigante, it has more darker scales to it, and it has a black metallic spikes opposed to the normal variant's bone spikes. There's Namiel, which is based on a vampire squid, as well as comb jellies. These are comb jellies. They're not anything else, they're comb jellies. Next we have Nursilla, which resembles most spiders, but has traits of a jumping spider, and is draped in a Gypceros hide. And there's the Shrouded Nursilla, which is a more dark gray with white and purple markings on it, and is draped in a Kezu hide. And an interesting fact about the Nursillas is the fact that they run up to the monster that they're stealing the hide from, rip its skin off, and then just leave it to die there, which is like, what the fuck? And then there's Rachnoid, which is based on jumping spiders and ticks, and is the baby version of Arachnakadaki. And then moving on to Arachnakadaki, it's based on the Jorogumo, a spider yokai that's name means entangling bride, hence the bridal-esque designs, as the Jorogumo basically hides itself as a bride, but is actually just a spider. And it also has spider designs from some spiders have their eggs on their back while they have them, much like the Arachnakadaki. Then looking at the Pyrantula, it's the same version as the Rachnoid, but fire, Then for the last creature of the known category, there's Pyrarachnakadaki, which is just the fire version of Arachnakadaki, and has black webbing to indicate loss, and its horns are also longer, giving it a more demonic appearance. Moving on to the monsters that I don't really have any clue about, starting with Yamasukami, which is, I assume, a giant octopus with human teeth and moss growing on the back of it, or like either like a sloth or turtle and or just an island in general from how big it is. Then looking at Acantor, it's a snapping turtle mixed with something, tusks, I assume a boar, and spikes on its back from the Ankylosaurus or a Polacanthus. Then moving to some of the fishes, we have Lavazeoth, which is most likely based on a coelacanth, but lava instead of water, and maybe a relative of the Plesioth. Then looking at Giratotus, it's just a water version of Lavazeoth, with the head resembling that of a snakehead fish. And Beototus, which is just a snow version of Lavazeoth, but with a horn on the head of it, most likely from like a narwhal. Then we have Ukinlos, which I have no idea what it would be based on, so I can only assume it's something to do with snow. Then looking at the Ludroth, I assume it's a Komodo dragon mixed with sponges, and the Royal Ludroth, which is just a bigger version, and its roar is apparently based on that of a red-tailed hawk. And then we have the Purple Ludroth, which is just purple instead and uses poison instead of water. Then looking at Agnactor, it looks like a lava version of Lagiacrus, and a mix of a Spinosaurus and Gharial. And then there's Uroctor, which is just the smaller version, and the Glacial Agnactor, which is the polar opposite of the normal variant, as well as having a harder beak for digging in the snow. Then, looking at Zamtrios, it's a general shark design, as well as a narwhal for the front horn, a basking shark, as well as a pufferfish. Then we have the Zamite, which is just the baby Zamtrios, and the tiger-striped Zamtrios, which has a more orange-brown color with some paleness, resembling that of a tiger. Then, looking at the Hornitar, it looks like a Hercules beetle with cricket legs, and then the Banahabra, which I assume can only be a wasp mixed with beetle wings. Then looking at the Celtis, it resembles a praying mantis as well as stink bugs, and the Desert Celtis, which has a more green, orange, and brown color with reduced flight, so it stays on the ground more. But it also has 2 prongs on the front instead of just the one. Then looking at the Celtis Queen, it has a crab-like body, minus the claws at the front, as well as having an earwig tail. And then looking at the Desert Celtis Queen, it has a more brownish green to it, and a narrower tail pincer. Then we have the Slagtoth, which resembles the Pachyrhinoceros, with dog jowls, these little flap things on dogs. For the Shamos, I don't really know. All I can assume is like a wolf mixed with a Komodo dragon and like cat eyes. And then for the Wolg, I assume it to be a wolf, badger, and like the body shape of a weasel. Then looking at Gone Goat, my best guess is a anteater mixed with a mountain goat and or pangolin. Then looking at Rathalos and Rathian, we have just like a normal wyvern-esque look to it with some tail spikes, as well as having that of a somewhat bird beak and goblin-like ears. And looking at the variants, we have the Azure Rathalos, which is just blue, Silver Rathalos, which is just silver, and Dread King Rathalos, which is the bigger version of the normal Rathalos, as well as having more striking colors, thicker talons and tail spines, and having a brighter pattern on its wings. Then for the Rathian variants, we have pink version, gold version, and the Dread Queen Rathian, which is bigger, has a more purple tint on its scales, and poison is like secreting out of its body, as well as seeps out when it does any tail attacks. Then looking at Yangaruga, we're actually going to be starting with the Scarred Yangaruga, because that is the first version that has shown up in games. I have no idea what the hell this is, other than people think it's a mix of a Rathian and Yankutku, and I can only really base it off of like a Gila monster in terms of aggressiveness as well as venom. And for its tail, all I can assume is like a sea urchin or something, because that's, again, poisonous. And Scarred Yangaruga is missing one of its ears, and one of its eyes is scarred. Then looking at Yangaruga, it's the unscarred version, and appears much later than the scarred version, which is strange. And looking at the Deadeye version, it's smaller than the normal variants. One of its eyes glows red, similar to that of a Nargacuga, and it has a clipped ear, and its wings and tail are mostly covered in moss. Then looking at Gypceros, it blinds people with, I assume, bioluminescence. It is like a possum by playing dead, and steals like a seagull, some of the resemblance of like beak structure, as well as having the tail structure of an Ankylosaurus, and the attack resembling that of a thresher shark. And purple Gypceros is purple. Then we have Seregios, which is most likely based on a secretary bird and a pine cone. And then we have Espinas, which is based on that of dragon fruit, and I assume poison dart frogs. An interesting thing about poison dart frogs is that they aren't actually poisonous to begin with, but become poisonous after eating enough poisonous bugs. And we also have Flaming Espinas, which has a brown carapace with red tinges across it, and its body is also covered in glowing orange veins to give that sort of fire molten aesthetic to it. Then looking at Basarios, it's the infant version of the Gravios, and is based off of rocks as well as chameleons that use their environment to blend into the background. And Ruby Basarios, which instead of rocks, it's just covered in rubies and moss, more likely to camouflage itself into cave-like environments. Then we have Gravios, which is the adult version of the Basarios, but it lost its horn and grew a new one, and also got a bigger tail. Then we have Black Gravios, which is the same as normal Gravios, but it's undergone a chemical change due to high body temperatures, so its skin changed to black. Then looking at Uragon, Uragon is based on metals and crystals, specifically Argonite, for its like squareness and extrudes across it. You can see it most directly on the back of it. And then looking at the Steel Uragon, it has a more deep metallic color instead of the gold color of the original, and is speculated to have fed on different ores. And looking at the Crystal Beard Uragon, it has a more orange-red body for its volcanic habitat, and bluish-purple crystals protruding from its chin, originating from most likely deep caves. Then looking at Radobon, it's the same as an Uragon, but with tar skin and bones instead of ores and gems. Next is the Leshen, which is one of the collabs that Monster Hunter did, being from The Witcher, and it's based on a Wendigo. And the Ancient Leshen is just the older version of a Leshen. Looking at Lao Shanlong, there wasn't much about him other than it's derived from the Chinese word for old mountain dragon, or these, and heavily looks like a European drake, and is meant to resemble a mountain. And then there's the variant, the Ashen Lao Shanlong, which is the normal version, but it's stuck around a volcano for a little too long, and it's got a bunch of ash all over it. Then looking at Alatrion, it's a classic medieval dragon mixed with the horns of Thai dragons. For Gen Moron, it's most likely based on a whale mixed with like a crocodile, turtle, boar tusks, and a mountain. And the hollowed version, which is slightly bigger and has violet ore covering its body instead of sandy hide. Next we have the Dire Moralis, which is based on like a European molten dragon look, and is potentially a distant relative of Fatalis, just from how they stand next to each other. They have the same sort of stand and same sort of look to them. Then looking at Daren Moron, it's most likely based on a walrus mixed with a whale, desert spikes, and like a shark head. And then there's Gogmazios, which is a zombie slash bone dragon, and covered with tar, as well as an ancient dragonator is lodged in its back. and it also has a similar body structure to that of a Gore Magala and Shigaru Magala, meaning it might be a really old Magala. Then we have Nikarchos, which is most likely based on a Hydra mixed with like a cephalopod, as well as possible Kraken connections. And we have Behemoth, which is one of the other collabs, which was for Final Fantasy, and all I could say is Behemoth was named after a large herbivore and land leviathan, being Behemoth from the Book of Job. Next we have Valhazak, which is based on deep sea fishes, as well as sort of a zombie look to it, and Blackveil Valhazak, which has moss growing all over it, which releases effluvium, and the growths can even make it blind at certain points. It also has a more green and white coloring, and the growths remind me that of fungal growths you'd see in insects. Lastly, for this section, we have Velkhana, which has name connections to that of Valkyries and Valhalla, being places that you want to strive to go to, kind of like the Hoarfrost Reach in Monster Hunter World. It's a place they're trying to find, but then they do. And it also matches some regal-esque poses of that of some horses correlated with royalty, and it has an overall medieval dragon look to it. Starting off the interesting monsters, we have the Apex monsters from Monster Hunter Rise. All the Apex monsters were monsters that had survived a storm and attacks from Wind Serpent Ibushi, and are in a constant state of fear and anger, so that's why they go on these rampages, which is to get as far away from Ibushi as possible, which I think is a cool way to explain the rampages, as well as just why the Apex monsters exist. Then moving to the Risen monsters, also from Rise, they are elder dragons that were infected with the Curio virus and managed to overcome it rather than dying to it, and they rose to new powers, and they all have a black and orange color scheme to them. Next we have the Kelby, which is a deer-like creature with some goat resemblance, who originally you could kill, but starting in Monster Hunter 3U, it gained immortality in that no matter what you do, you cannot kill it, you can only knock it out, and after doing much research, I decided that it was most likely that the Kelbys followed the ways of the Taoist immortals and gained immortality via them. Then moving to the Shakalaka, they are humanoid Lineans with traditional African masks, and the King Shakalaka is the same, but basically quote-unquote chieftain of them, and the Gajalaka is just a more modern-esque looking Shakalaka, as well as the Chief, which is the same, but with fine facial hair, and the Boa Boa, which is the same as them, but a snow variant. Then we're moving on to the best monster in the game, being that from Monster Hunter 3, which is fish. Now you're wondering, what the fuck is fish? And you go, well, these are the fish. They're tuna, sunfish, catfish, arowana, shark, and jellyfish. These ones are really easy to look at because they're just their real-life counterparts. But most importantly is the Gajau, which, if you compare the Gajau and catfish, they look a little similar. That's because they are. They're the exact same monster, but it got its own name and world, which is the best thing you can possibly have in the world. Then moving on to Rajang, it's a mix of a gorilla with the Texas Longhorn, as well as the myth of Sun Wukong, who through Taoist practices managed to obtain mystical powers. Now, you could say that it's based off of Sun Wukong, but you could also say that it was based off of Goku, and I think that that is much better, even though Goku is also based off of Sun Wukong. Rajang also happens to have an attack from Blanca from Street Fighter, and then moving on to Furious Rajang, he has no tail, either by it falling off itself naturally, or by ripping it off himself. And Furious Rajang is always enraged and can go even further beyond, much like that of a Super Saiyan. Then looking at Zenogre, it's based on the Japanese folklore of the Raiju, which is a thunder wolf, and looking at the variants, we have the Stygian Zenogre, which is gray, white, and red in color scheme, and is much larger than the normal variants. And instead of having Fulgur bugs, the bugs that are electric around the normal Zinogre, it has Dracophage bugs, which were Fulgur bugs that actually ate Dragonfell berries. Then looking at the Thunderlord Zinogre, its default state is the enraged normal Zinogre, and one horn is bigger than the other, and its scales are green, and its fur and claws are golden. It also crackles with green electricity constantly, but turns to gold when it's enraged. Then looking at Brachydios, it's based off of the mantis shrimp as well as Yankees for the Pompadour-esque head, and or, if you don't want to say it's based off of Yankees, it's based off of Josuke from JoJo Part 4. Then looking at the Raging Brachydios, its green slime was replaced with yellow orangish slime that when enraged becomes red, and from World, it has a bangin' final area. And looking at Atal Ka, being the best final boss in any Monster Hunter game, is based on Egyptian pharaohs as well as the Sphinx for its mech suit, as well as the Devil's Flower Mantis. Then looking at the Basilgeuse, it is of course inspired by the American World War II bomber aircraft, the Convair B-36 Peacemaker, with maybe a little bit of pangolin mixed in. And the Seething Basilgeuse has a more metallic blue coloring to it. Its normal state is also the enraged state of the normal version, and the enraged state goes further to where its scales glow white and purplish white. Then looking at the Hypnocatrix, it's a mix of a cockatrice as well as a peafowl for its plumage, and I'm using the word peafowl because I found out through this research that all peafowls are called peafowls, and just the male versions are called peacocks.
Then, looking at Anjanath, it's a mixture of a vulture and a T-Rex.
Then there's the Fulgur Anjanath, which has white bluish colors as well as gray stripes on it, and it crackles with blue electricity when charged, and its nasal crest will also light up blue when charged. Then, looking at the Dodogama, it's a mix of a chubby iguana as well as having possible gastrolith connections, which I found out gastroliths are when animals can't digest foods properly, so they end up eating rocks in order to digest foods in a proper way, which I assume Dodogama would be doing. Then looking at the Legiana, you think, what the hell is this based off of? And of course, it's based off of a sea slug, and you think, what the hell kind of sea slug was this based off of? And it was based off of this, the blue Glaucus, which happens to look exactly like the Legiana. Then looking at the variant, the Shrieking Legiana, it has black on its chest, and its tail and wings are covered in spiky ice. Moving on to the Tobi Kadachi, it's based on flying squirrels and gliding snakes, as well as an actual taser, and having the face of a colubrid snake. And the variant, the Viper Tobi Kadachi, has more brown-orangish colors to it, and its tail has poison spikes growing out of it, as well as its eyes are now golden. Then looking at the Gos Harag, it's based on a bear as well as the Namahage yokai, and when the hunter is stunned and knocked down in the game, it will slowly approach them before slamming down its sword, much like that of a drumstick. Then looking at Garen Golem, it's based on Frankenstein's monster, as well as the Golem of Prague, and I know that it's mostly based off of what everyone thinks of Frankenstein, being the big, chunky head, but I'd like to think it's based off of Junji Ito's Frankenstein, being that that is the best version of Frankenstein. And then looking at Lunagaron, it's based off of werewolves, as well as Fenrir and the Beast of Gévaudan. Then moving to Fatalis, it's similarly based off of most European dragons, as well as the dragon in the poem of Beowulf. The dragon in Beowulf doesn't appear too much, kind of appears every now and then, and you go, ooh, spooky. But in the final battle, it's the final battle that Beowulf has against this giant looming threat being the dragon, especially its fire being explained as being extremely dangerous and basically impossible to live from if you were hit by that fire, which, hey, that seems to happen in the game. Then looking at Crimson Fatalis, it is much like normal Fatalis, except it spent way too much time in a volcano and became quite red. And then moving on to White Fatalis, I am specifically putting it in the Fatalis area, despite actually being more of a cousin to Fatalis. And a lot of people misconcept them as being Old Fatalis, which it was named that originally, but it later got changed to White Fatalis, specifically because of the elements and just the fur resemblance, being that of it having lightning instead of fire, and it resembling more of a Kirin, based on the shining scales and the fur being much more onto it. Then moving on to Kirin, it's literally just based off of a mythological creature named Kirin, great name change, and it has a little bit more of a western unicorn mixed into it. Then looking at its variant, the Orochi Kirin, it is much like the normal Kirin, but has a more dark blue and violet color tone to it, with red eyes and a larger horn, including an ice element. Then looking at the Cadus, it is a manatee mixed with a giant whale and the Dunkleostus, and large horns of that of a Texas longhorn, with some traits of boars, being that its horns will slowly grow until blinding it. But some boars have been known to where their tusks grow too much to the point where it bores into their own skull and then kills them. Then looking at the Goldbeard Cadus, it is the supposedly fully grown Cadus, having a more darker coloring to it and golden highlights, and its horns have now fully grown over its eyes, making it blind. Then moving on to the Gore Magala. Gore Magala was based off of the Xenomorph from Alien, as well as the Frenzy virus, being the mad cow disease, and the Shigaru Magala, which is the adult version of Gore Magala, which has assumed control over the virus and has fully grown out its body, being like wings, horns. Its color has shown out more. It's got eyes now. Then looking at the chaotic Gore Magala, it's a Gore Magala that was in the middle of molting into a Shigaru Magala, but was stopped by an actual Shigaru Magala in order to defend its territory, so it's actually only half molted and is therefore extremely unstable and volatile, and it will die extremely quickly if it is unable to molt, or it will die pretty quickly if a hunter kills it as well. Then looking at Volstrox, it's most likely based on a jet as well as a falcon, and the Crimson Glow Volstrox, which has a more permanent glow to it, and the wings look more like exhaust vents, looking red from the heat, and when inhaling air, the wings as well as the vents in its chest and shoulders will spew out dragon energy. Then looking at Kolv Teroth, it's a bit up in the air what it's based off of, but it's most likely either the Egyptian gods being Apis or Amun, which have scaled gold statues in the forms of bulls or rams, or based on that of the Greek mythology of the Golden Fleece. Then looking at Xenojiva, I personally love this explanation, being that it's implied that it came from another world via a meteor, which you can see in its alien-like design, but it also translates to something really cool, being Xeno can often mean alien or unknown, and Jiva can often mean life or life form, which would make it translate to alien or unknown life form, which I think is very cool. Then looking at Safi Jiva, it's the quote-unquote adult version of the Xenojiva, and is based heavily on classic medieval dragons, and its name roughly translates to pure life, meaning that it's molted and fully adapted to the life forms on this planet. Then looking at Zora Magdaros, its head is that of a snapping turtle, and its body is much like classic kaiju, and it has overall designs of a volcano. Then looking at Shara Ishvalda, its face resembles a lotus flower, and when standing, it can often depict multi-armed Hindu deities. And one thing I think is crazy about this monster is that its eyes, a lot of people think are really creepy because often when you are looking around and you look at its eyes, they're always looking at you, they're always looking at the camera, and that's not the way the designers intended it. It's just the way that the shape of the eyes are, and it gives that illusion. So if I put up this image and you proceed to walk around and look at it at different angles, the eye will always be looking directly at you, which is not an intentional thing, it just happened to give the illusion. Then, looking at Thunder Serpent Narwa, it's a mix of Japanese dragons as well as the god Raijin, as well as Wind Serpent Ibushi, which is also based on Japanese dragons, and the god Fujin. And looking at the variant for Narwa being Narwa the Allmother, Narwa achieves the form by consuming Wind Serpent Ibushi and fertilizing her eggs, looking much like Raijin in that there are 8 eggs, much like Raijin's 8 drums. Her tail also elongates, and her entire color scheme becomes that of an apex monster, and her eyes switch between yellow and red for when she's enraged and not. Next, looking at Malzeno. Malzeno depicts that of a vampire being infected with the Curio virus, which gives it powers, and similar to that of a vampire, which were known to have made deals with the devil in order to gain powers unseen. And then for its variant Primordial Malzeno, having a more silver, gold, and purple colors to it, is a form of Malzeno that was never infected with the Curio virus and is more akin to royalty or a knight. And as the fight progresses, it's infected with more Curio until eventually looking similar to the Risen variants of Elder Dragons. And lastly, looking at Geismagorm, it depicts the devil or Satan, namely with being the start of the Curio virus and giving it to Malzeno, as well as its mouth opening to a pentagram. That marks the end of the monsters. Again, I just want to say, this wasn't a full-depth research, so I'm most likely missing a lot of information. Probably a couple monsters, possibly some facts about which monsters were related to what. So if I am, please let me know down below. But overall, after finding out these different things about these monsters and how these people put so much time and appreciation into what they were based on and how they looked, I can say without a doubt that my new favorite monster is the Gajou. Thank you for watching.